On an ordinary afternoon, I carried a lunch bag to surprise my son at his office. I thought it would be a moment of warmth between father and son. Instead, he looked at me, cold as stone, and said, "Don't ever come here again." I walked out without a word, but inside, something broke. What he didn't know was that the office he tried to ban me from would soon belong to me. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. The words slipped out of his mouth as if they had been rehearsed, sharp and polished, like a knife that had been waiting for years to draw blood. My own son, the boy I carried on my shoulders when he was too tired to walk. The boy I sat beside through nights of fever and fear, looked me in the eye across his mahogany desk and said, "Don't come to my office again, Dad." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his hand down. No, it was worse than that. He said it with the casual cruelty of someone swatting a fly. His hand never stopped moving across the papers in front of him. His eyes didn't even flicker. With hesitation, he might as well have been telling a delivery man to use the back entrance, or a stranger that they had overstayed their welcome. For a moment, the air in the room seemed to vanish. My lungs forgot what to do. The weight of his words pressed against my chest until I thought I might choke. All I heard was the hum of the air conditioner and the faint ticking of a clock behind me. Time itself seemed to mock me, reminding me of all the hours, the years, the decades I had given him. I had come that day not to interfere, not to lecture, not to remind him of the debts he owed me, not in money, but in sacrifices etched into the quiet corners of his life. I came simply to see him, to ask if he wanted to join me for lunch. An old man, holding a paper bag with 2 sandwiches inside, wrapped the way his mother used to make them. But to him, I was not a father anymore. I was an interruption, a liability, a ghost haunting the polished floor of his empire. His secretary didn't look up from her desk when I left his office. Perhaps she had been told not to. Perhaps she already knew this was coming. The building seemed colder than it had just hours earlier when I walked in, hopeful. My steps echoed against the marble floor like I was trespassing in a place I had once paid for with sweat and sleepless nights. When I reached the street, the noise of the city crashed around me, the honk of horns, the chatter of strangers, the endless rhythm of a world that didn't care. I stood there on the sidewalk with that paper bag still in my hand, my knuckles tight around it until the bread inside was crushed. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't plead. I simply stood still, the words replaying in my head like a curse I couldn't wash away. And when I finally started walking again, it wasn't toward home, it wasn't toward him, it was simply away, away from the office, away from the version of myself that had believed family was unbreakable. As I walked, memories forced themselves on me like uninvited guests. His first day at school, clinging to my hand until the teacher smiled and coaxed him forward. The night I stayed awake fixing his broken bicycle, so that he could ride with the other boys the next morning without shame. The day he graduated, shaking my hand in front of his friends as though I were a mentor, not just a father. And his wedding, where I gave a speech about love and loyalty, believing that the son I had raised understood both. All those memories lined up against me now, whispering accusations. You gave him everything. You thought it was enough. You thought he would remember. But what stood out most wasn't the moments of pride, it was the sacrifices he never saw. The nights I went without food so he could eat. The second job I took when tuition bills became mountains. The time I sold my wife's gold bangles, her last inheritance from her mother, just to cover the down payment on his first office space. She had smiled through tears when I told her, saying, "It's for him. One day, he'll know what this costs us." But he never did. Or maybe he knew and chose to forget. By the time I reached the park, the paper bag in my hand had torn, and one of the sandwiches fell onto the path. I didn't bother picking it up. A bird hopped over and began pecking at it while I kept walking. The sight of it, something made with love reduced to scraps for strangers, felt almost poetic. When I reached a bench, I finally sat down. My hands trembled, not with age, but with the rage I refused to let spill out. People passed by without noticing me, just another old man sitting alone. But inside me, a storm was brewing. I thought of my wife, gone now these many years, and wondered what she would have said if she had been there in that office with me. She had always been the softer voice, the mediator, the one who believed kindness could cure cruelty. Perhaps she would have placed her hand on mine, whispered that our son was just stressed, that I shouldn't take it to heart. But she wasn't there. And without her, there was no shield between me and the blade of his words. I sat in silence until the shadows grew long and the city lights flickered on. The day had moved forward, indifferent to my heartbreak. And I realized then that silence had become my ally. Not the silence of weakness, but of patience. The kind of silence that waits, observes, learns. When I finally stood, it wasn't with the weight of defeat. It was with the clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose. The boy I had raised had drawn a line in the sand. He had told me where I did not belong. And though he didn't realize it, in that moment, he had also told me exactly where I needed to go. I walked home slowly, but not aimlessly. My son thought he had dismissed me from his world. What he didn't understand was that I had built that world brick by brick, dollar by dollar, sacrifice by sacrifice. It was mine long before it was ever his. And as I reached my door, I whispered words into the night. words that were not a vow, but a truth I already knew in my bones. Forgotten who I am, but they'll remember. When I walked back into my house that evening, the air felt different, as though even the walls had overheard what my son had said to me, and were waiting for my reaction. The key turned in the lock the way it always had, but when the door opened, I felt like I was stepping into a museum of a life that no longer belonged to me. The house had stood for decades, weathering storms, summers, and winters alike. I had poured my soul into its foundation, into every beam and nail. I remembered when we first bought the plot of land, nothing but dirt and stones. My wife and I had stood side by side, staring at that empty stretch, and she whispered, "This will be where they grow up. This will be where we grow old." And so it became. The kitchen was the heart of it. The table bore the scars of years of meals, knife scratches, a burn mark from when my daughter accidentally set down a hot pan without thinking, faint rings from cups of tea drunk in the quiet hours of the night. I remembered Sunday mornings, when the smell of pancakes would drift through the house, and my children would stumble out of their rooms, still heavy-eyed but smiling. They would sit there in mismatched pajamas, their hair sticking up in all directions, and laugh about nothing in particular. My wife would hum as she cooked, and I would sit at the head of the table, feeling that nothing outside those walls could touch us. Evenings were no different. We ate together, always together. My son, the same one who had told me I wasn't welcome in his office, once told me at 13 years old that he wanted to be just like me. "Dad," he had said, his mouth still full of mashed potatoes, "you make everything feel safe." I smiled at him that night, not knowing that the word safe could one day turn into unwanted. I moved into the living room, where the old couch still sagged in the middle from too many bodies piled onto it. Movie nights had been our tradition. We didn't need expensive vacations, not when we could turn off the lights, share a bowl of popcorn, and laugh at comedies until tears rolled down our faces. I could still hear their voices echoing through the years. My daughter shrieking in delight when her favorite character appeared, my wife gently shushing them when the noise grew too loud. And I remembered how my son used to curl up against me, his head resting on my shoulder, asking questions about the story unfolding on screen. But the house was more than just laughter and warmth. It was built on sacrifice. When the roof leaked, I was the one who climbed up in the rain, hammer in hand, while my children watched nervously from the window. When the furnace broke in the middle of winter, I worked double shifts to pay for the repair, returning home exhausted but relieved to find the house warm again. Every time the foundation cracked, I patched it myself. Every time the walls needed painting, I stayed up late, brush in hand. Even when my back ached, my wife's touch was in every corner. She chose the curtains in the dining room, soft, floral, prints that faded over the years but never lost their charm. She planted roses by the front steps, and for as long as she lived, she trimmed them with care, as though each blossom carried a piece of her. After she passed, I kept tending them, not because I had her gift, but because I couldn't bear to see them die. They became her voice to me, blooming every spring as if to remind me that she was still here in some way. The hallway was lined with photographed school plays, birthdays, graduations. Each frame was a story. There was one where my son stood grinning with a medal around his neck, his arm slung around my shoulder. I had been so proud that day, prouder than he ever knew. I had stayed up nights helping him study, quizzing him, until his eyelids drooped. That medal wasn't just his, it was ours. And yet, when I looked at it now, hanging there on the wall, it felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I climbed the stairs slowly, running my hand along the banister. I had built myself. I could still see the pencil marks on the wall where we measured the children's heights year after year, each line climbing higher, each name scribbled beside it. My son's lines rose fastest, stretching toward the ceiling as though he couldn't wait to outgrow us all. My daughter's handwriting was neater, smaller, patient, and now, those marks stood frozen in time, a relic of a family that no longer existed. I walked into my bedroom. The bed was too large now, too empty without her. Her side still smelled faintly of lavender, though it had been years. I sat on the edge, staring at the spot where she used to read before falling asleep, and I wondered what she would think of our son now. Would she blame me for failing him? Or would she see what I saw, that some children carry the weight of love only long enough to set it down when it no longer benefits them? The silence in the house pressed in on me. Once it had been filled with footsteps, laughter, and arguments about trivial things: who got the last cookie, whose turn it was to do the dishes, why the television remote was always missing. Now it was nothing but the creak of old wood and the hum of the refrigerator. Even the walls seemed to ache with loneliness. I sat in the dining room again, staring at the empty chairs. Once, every seat had been filled. Now they stood like sentinels around the table, accusing me of not being able to keep my family together. My son had a life of his own now, an empire built on the foundation I had sacrificed for, but there was no place for me in it. I leaned back, letting my eyes close. The memories came unbidden, the laughter of my daughter as she danced barefoot in the kitchen, the warmth of my wife's hand in mine as we watched them, the soft glow of candlelight. On birthdays when we couldn't afford electricity, but still made it a celebration. Every inch of this house was proof of my love. And yet, sitting there in the silence, I realized that love had turned into absence. presence had turned into loss. Everything I had given was taken for granted, and now this house, this temple of memory, was nothing more than an echo chamber. I opened my eyes and looked around one last time. The house hadn't changed. Not really, but I had. And the truth struck me with a force I couldn't deny. It used to be filled with love. Now it echoed with silence. Money was never just paper to me. It was hours of my life folded into bills. Years of sacrifice printed in ink. Every check I wrote, every loan I signed, every envelope I handed to my children carried pieces of my body and soul. And when I think back now, it feels less like generosity and more like I was bleeding out slowly, drop by drop. While they smiled and told me I was their rock, I still remember the day I walked into the bank with my son, his acceptance letter to college trembling in his hands. He was so proud, so nervous. He had worked hard, but not hard enough to carry the weight of tuition alone. I signed my name on papers I barely understood, co-signing a loan that would keep him afloat. The banker looked at me and said, "Are you sure you want this responsibility? It's a heavy one." I didn't hesitate. "Of course," I said, "because when you're a father, there are no calculations, only instincts." Years later, when he crossed that graduation stage in his cap and gown, I was in the audience with tears in my eyes. He found me afterward, the diploma still warm in his hand, and he hugged me so tightly that I thought maybe all the debt and sacrifice had been worth it. He whispered into my ear, "We'll always be there for you, Dad." I clung to those words like scripture, never realizing they would one day turn into a lie. And then came the wedding. Oh, how beautiful it was. They wanted it spilling from every corner, a band that played until midnight, a venue that sparkled with chandeliers. I remember my wife and I looking at each other when the numbers came in, our stomachs tightening. But I had already convinced myself, it's his one day, he deserves it. So I dipped into savings that had been meant for retirement. Money we had planned to live on in our old age. I told myself we had time to rebuild, that love would come back to us tenfold. I stood there that night, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit anymore, watching him dance with his new bride under the lights. His face glowed with joy, and when he looked over at me and mouthed, "Thank you," I thought my chest might burst. It wasn't the money I wanted. It was the gratitude, the bond, the unspoken promise that families are forever. There were countless smaller moments too, the ones no one noticed. The down payment for his first office, when the bank demanded more collateral. I gave him the deed to my house without thinking, saying, "Don't worry, it's just paperwork." The time his car broke down and I signed the check to cover it, even though I needed new shoes myself. The nights I skipped meals so the mortgage could be paid on time, telling my wife, "I'm not hungry tonight," when really, I was starving. Receipts still live in my drawers, yellowed and brittle with age. They are ghosts of transactions that never should have been necessary. Each one feels like a piece of evidence in a trial only I am attending. Gasoline for road trips to move him into dorms, boxers from furniture stores so his first apartment didn't feel empty, hospital bills when he was too young to understand what medical debt even meant. My handwriting scrawled on the memo lines, "For you, don't worry, we'll manage." But what haunts me more than the receipts are the words that accompanied them. "You're the best, Dad. I'll never forget this. We'll take care of you when you're older." Those promises were spoken like vows, binding in the moment, sacred in my heart. I never asked for repayment in money. I only asked for remembrance, for respect, for the simple acknowledgement that love had been costly, but freely given. And then, years later, in that office where he told me not to return, I realized those promises had expired. They weren't bonds. They were paper currency burned long ago. His words that day, "Don't come to my office again," landed with the finality of foreclosure. The debt was not only unpaid, it was erased as if it had never existed. The cruelest part was not that he forgot the sacrifices. It was that he erased them. He built his success atop my foundation, then told me I didn't belong in the building I had helped construct. The same hands that had once pulled him out of sickness, signed checks for his future, lifted boxers for his office, now shook in silence. As he dismissed me like a beggar, I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, memories playing like a reel of film. My wife and I counting pennies in the kitchen while the children slept upstairs. Her hand over mine, whispering, "It will be worth it." My son running into my arms after his graduation saying, "I'll never forget what you did for me." The applause at his wedding where I gave a speech about the meaning of family. All of it replayed until I wanted to scream, but I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't plead with ghosts. I simply lay there, letting the truth carve itself into me like stone. They didn't just forget me. They erased the debt I paid with love. The morning after my son dismissed me from his office, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The bitterness clung to my tongue, but I drank it anyway, needing the weight of something real. The silence of the house pressed around me, louder than words. My wife's chair across from me sat empty, as it had for years, but that day it felt like she was there, watching, waiting for me to make a choice. I opened the drawer by my elbow and pulled out the old accordion folder where I kept copies of documents, deeds, receipts, loan agreements. I had always been careful, meticulous, My son may have forgotten where he came from, but I had kept records. My fingers trembled as I sorted through them, not from age but from something sharper, an intuition whispering that I didn't yet know the full extent of his betrayal. That whisper grew into certainty when I found a loan agreement with my signature at the bottom, a loan I barely remembered co-signing back when my son was just starting his business. He had promised me it was a formality, that he'd handle the payments. I believed him. Now the dates told a different story. Payments had stopped, defaults had been filed. My stomach sank as I read the fine print. The responsibility had reverted to me. I didn't want to believe it. Surely there was a mistake. So I took the folder, tucked it under my arm, and walked to the bank. The same bank where I had stood with pride years ago, signing away my future so my children could have theirs. The lobby was bright with glass and steel, polished floors reflecting a world too clean to understand the dirt of sacrifice. The clerk at the desk smiled politely when I asked for an account officer, but when I sat down with her, and she pulled up the records tied to my name, the smile disappeared. "Sir," she said gently, "you're still listed as guarantor on several active loans." She turned the screen toward me. Numbers stared back, numbers that didn't add up to pride or gratitude, but two chains. Some of these are in default. One is close to bankruptcy filing. I leaned closer, my hand tightening on the edge of the desk. "These were his," I said, my voice low but steady. "My son's? He told me he paid them." She gave me the kind of look you give an old man who doesn't yet realize the world has moved past him. "Legally, sir, it doesn't matter. As guarantor, the burden falls to you." I thanked her, stood, and walked out with the weight of her words pressing down on me like a stone. The city outside seemed louder, crueler. Every car horn, every passing conversation felt like a reminder. You are paying for someone else's life. I didn't go home. Instead, I walked into the office of an old lawyer I had once worked with. His hair was whiter now, his office smaller, but his eyes were sharp as ever. When I laid the folder on his desk, he frowned, adjusted his glasses, and began reading. For an hour, silence stretched between us, broken only by the rustle of paper. Finally, he looked up. "They used you," he said flatly. "You co-signed not just the business loan, but two separate mortgages. One on his home, another on the office building, and there are credit lines your name's attached there too. If he defaults completely, they'll come for you." I sat back in my chair, my chest heavy but my mind suddenly clear. And he knew this. The lawyer nodded. He would have. "These aren't mistakes. These are choices." It was as though the floor shifted beneath me. All the years of sacrifice, the endless giving, the trust I had placed in him, it had not been forgotten. It had been exploited. He had built his empire on my name, my credit, my labor, my love. And now, with his words "don't come to my office," again he had tried to cut me out of the very story he had written on my back. I thanked the lawyer and gathered my papers. My movements deliberate, calm. Rage was a luxury I couldn't afford. Grief was a weakness I had already paid for. What I needed now was clarity. On the walk home, I passed shop windows reflecting a man I barely recognized, older, slower, worn, but behind the wrinkles, I saw something else. The man I used to be, before fatherhood softened me, before sacrifice hollowed me. I had been sharp, strategic, I had built a life from nothing, brick by brick, not because I was given power, but because I learned to take it when no one else would. They thought I was grieving. They thought I was a relic, a burden, a ghost haunting their success. They thought the years had dulled me, but they forgot something essential. They forgot I was trained for this. I had spent years believing that my best days were behind me, that my sharpest tools had dulled with age, that all I was meant to do in these later chapters of life was sit quietly and wait for the end. That's what they thought too. They mistook my silence for weakness, my patience for surrender. What they forgot was that before I was a father, before I was a husband, before I was reduced to a man dismissed from his own son's office, I was a strategist. I knew numbers the way a soldier knows his weapon, the way a surgeon knows his scalpel. I once worked as a banker, and in those years, I learned how money moves, how contracts trapped, how a single clause hidden in fine print can decide whether a man builds a kingdom or loses it overnight. Those instincts had not vanished. They had only been buried under years of sacrifice and trust. Now, digging them back up felt less like rediscovery and more like resurrection. The first call I made was to an old colleague, a man who had once been a junior under me and now ran his own consulting firm. He answered the phone with surprise, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who still remembered. "It's been years," he said. "What can I do for you?" "I need reports," I told him flatly. "Financial, legal, public records on my son's businesses, every loan, every lien, every contract tied to his name." There was silence, and then a low whistle. "You're going after him?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Within a week, thick envelopes began to arrive at my door. I spread them across my dining table, the same table where my children once ate breakfast before school. Now it became a war room. Pages upon pages of statements, filings, contracts, defaults, numbers bled across the paper, each one a story of recklessness disguised as ambition. I read them the way a general studies terrain, looking for weaknesses, for choke points, for paths to victory that were mortgages that had been refinanced 3 times. Loans stacked upon loans, shell companies registered under names that linked back to him through careless signatures. I traced payments overseas, transfers that began as whispers in one account and ended up as silence in another. It was all there, laid bare in black and white. The next step was to reconnect with the lawyer I trusted. Together, we dissected every contract. We highlighted clauses, circled loopholes, underlined responsibilities. He looked at me once across the desk and said, "You're reading these faster than I can. I taught men like you how to read them." I reminded him. For days I lived among the papers. My house, once echoing with absence, now throbbed with the rustle of documents, the scrape of my pen, the steady hum of my mind sharpening itself again. I drew timelines, built charts, pinned notes against corkboards like evidence in a trial that only I was attending. Each piece fit together into a picture my son thought I'd never see. What he didn't realize was that while he dismissed me as old, I had once built reputations by predicting collapses before they came. In my years as a banker, I watched empires crumble because they believed themselves untouchable. I had studied the anatomy of downfall long enough to know that pride and debt are siblings. They grow together, feed each other, and in the end, they bury you the same way. I began to call in favors. Men who owed me their careers picked up my calls. Women who had once been interns and now sat in high places remembered the way I had guided them when no one else did. One by one, doors opened. Access was granted. Files appeared on my desk that my son would never have believed I could obtain, and I never rushed. That was the difference, he thought, in short-term victories. The next deal, the next expansion, the next profit. I thought in decades. I thought in patience. I thought in inevitabilities. I ordered forensic accountants to dig deeper. Their reports came back with numbers my son thought were hidden, debts he believed buried, bankruptcy whispered from the margins, fraud tiptoed across signatures. He had built his empire on sand, and I was watching the tide roll in, but I didn't act. Not yet. The beauty of strategy is not in speed but in timing. Every move I made was deliberate, invisible. He would not even know the game had begun until the checkmate was already staring him in the face. And in those quiet hours, as I sat surrounded by stacks of paper, I felt something stir in me that I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. It was colder than love, sharper than grief, steadier than rage. It was clarity. My son thought he had dismissed me from his world. In truth, he had just invited me back to the very battlefield I had once ruled. I leaned back in my chair one night, the reports spread before me like a chessboard. My son believed he was the king, untouchable on his throne. But I had played this game long before he was born. I had written the rules, and as I traced my finger along the final report, a spitting deliberate tugged at my lips. You don't play chess with someone who invented the board. I didn't need to lift a finger. That was the beauty of it. Once the truth was uncovered, once the paper trail lay bare before me, all I had to do was wait. Numbers have gravity. Lies collapse under their own weight. Pride always topples itself, if you give it time. The first crack came quietly, like a whisper through the wind. My son's secretary, the same young woman who had refused to meet my eyes when I left his office that day, resigned suddenly. I read about it in a small note buried in a business journal. Irregularities in payroll, the article speculated. I knew better. Payroll is always the first thing to wobble when cash begins to dry up. Soon after, the bank letters began. Thin white envelopes that carried heavy consequences. I didn't open them. I didn't need to. Word drifted through old contacts that loan renewals were being denied, applications rejected, credit lines frozen. He had built his empire on borrowed foundations, and now those foundations were crumbling beneath him. I watched from the distance of silence. Each morning I sat at my dining table with the newspaper, coffee warm in my hands, and read about unforeseen setbacks in his ventures. His face, once grinning proudly in glossy spreads about rising entrepreneurs, now looked tense, eyes hollowed, smile strained. The captions beneath spoke of financial turbulence and challenging quarters. They used polite words, but I knew the language of collapse better than anyone. Then came the public arguments. At first, they were whispers. My daughter-in-law snapping at him during a charity gala, their faces caught mid-ongar by cameras that never forgive. Rumors swirling that vendors weren't being paid on time, that employees were quitting without notice. I saw clips online of him storming out of meetings, his tie askew, his temper fraying. I didn't call. I didn't interfere. I simply watched. Like a man watching a house he once built, now rot from the inside, beam by beam. The car breakdowns amused me and their poetry. He had always loved to flaunt his fleet of expensive cars, shining machines polished to perfection, each one a symbol of success he insisted was his alone. But one by one, they began to falter. I drove past once, unseen in my modest old sedan, and there he was on the side of the road, pacing furiously beside a sleek black car with smoke curling from under the hood. His wife sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, face like stone. I slowed just enough to see, then kept driving. It was not pity I felt, it was inevitability. And then came the foreclosure letters. The house he had bought, grand and hollow, with rooms too many for a family too small, was suddenly listed for auction. I saw the notice in the legal section of the paper, printed small, almost insignificant to the world, but to me, it was louder than any scream. The office building followed soon after, the very place he had told me not to come back to. I traced the notice with my finger, a smile touching my lips. They began to whisper in the neighborhood. Neighbors, who once envied his success, now shook their heads and clucked their tongues. Friends who had filled his house with laughter during parties now stopped answering his calls. His empire had not fallen with thunder, it crumbled with silence, one piece at a time, until the absence of support was all that remained. I observed it all as though from a high hill, watching the battlefield below. Each move he made to save himself only tangled him deeper. Each desperate attempt at a loan, each argument with creditors, each public denial made his downfall louder, clearer, sharper, and still, I never intervened. I didn't need to. My silence did more damage than any weapon could, because he knew, somewhere in the back of his mind, that I was watching. He knew that the man he had cast aside was now the shadow lingering behind every collapse. Sometimes at night, I would walk into the garden where my wife's roses still bloomed. I'd sit there in the quiet, the moonlight casting silver across the petals, and I would think of her. She had always believed kindness was stronger than cruelty. I wondered what she would say if she saw me now, sitting in the ruins of what our son had built. Would she call me cruel? Or would she finally understand that cruelty had never been my weapon? Truth was, days stretched into weeks, and the unraveling accelerated. He sold possessions, art, jewelry, even the cars he once paraded so proudly. But no matter how much he sold, the debts outpaced him. I read each listing, each auction, each desperate move with the calm of a man who had already seen the ending. In the quiet of my home, where once laughter echoed and now only the turning of pages filled the air, I reflected, my son had believed I was the rain, that I had always been the one to pour sustenance onto his barren soil, to make things grow when they should have withered. He had mistaken my sacrifices for an endless downpour, but the truth was different. I was never the rain, I was the drought. It began with a knock at my door, not the casual kind, not the knock of a neighbor asking to borrow sugar, but the frantic pounding of someone whose pride had already bled out on the road before they even reached my house. I knew that rhythm. I had heard it before, long ago, when he was a boy who had scraped his knee and came running home. Now he was a man, and the wound was deeper than skin. When I opened the door, there he stood, my son. His once polished suit was wrinkled, his tie missing, his hair unkempt. Behind him, his wife hovered, her eyes red, mascara streaked down her face. They looked like survivors of a storm, but I knew the storm wasn't finished with them yet. Dad, he started, his voice breaking. Please, we need to talk. I didn't answer. I stepped aside, and they entered, their shoes carrying the dust of defeat across my floor. We sat in the dining room. He took the chair across from me, the same chair he had once sat in as a boy, swinging his legs, telling me about school. Now his legs trembled for different reasons. He began with excuses. The economy turned on us. Investors pulled out. It's not my fault. You know how it is. His voice was desperate, thin. Then he shifted to flattery. You've always been the smart one. You know more than anyone how money works. You could help us get back on our feet. Still, I said nothing. His wife spoke next. She leaned forward, her voice softer, carrying the weight of practiced manipulation. He's your son. He's still your boy, and I'm your daughter. Family is supposed to forgive. Isn't that what mom would have wanted? At her name, something flickered in me, but I gave no sign. They tried to pull her ghost into the room as though it might move me, as though they could use her memory as currency. But memories are not legal tender. Dad, please, my son whispered, his hands covering his face. You helped me once. Before you paid for my school, you gave me everything. Just one more time, I'm begging you. His voice cracked, and the silence that followed was heavier than his words. I studied him as he wept into his hands. The same man who once told me not to step foot in his office now sat in my kitchen, choking on the air that used to be his safe place. I remembered the boy who once whispered at his graduation, "We'll always be there for you, Dad." That boy was gone. What sat before me was a debtor dressed in desperation. He reached across the table suddenly, grabbing my wrist like a drowning man clutching at driftwood. I swear I'll make it right. I swear I'll pay you back. Just please help me this once. You're all we have left. I pulled my hand back slowly, calmly. His grip slipped away like water through a sieve. Their words grew frantic. His wife pleaded, her voice rising. Think of the children. They need their grandfather. They need stability. You can't let them lose everything. Children, stability, grandfather. Each word was carefully chosen, aimed at the softest parts of me, but I had hardened those places long ago. They thought my silence meant indecision. They didn't realize silence was the sharpest answer of all. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Their begging shifted into bargaining, bargaining into accusations, accusations back into begging. A cycle of desperation that only deepened, the cracks already splintering their lives. And through it all, I said nothing. Finally, the tears slowed. The words dried. My son slumped in his chair, broken, hollow, His wife looked at me with eyes full of hatred disguised as grief. They realized then what I had known from the start. I wasn't their family anymore. I was their creditor. They returned a week later, hollow-eyed and thinner, like people who had walked too far under a sun that refused to set. I had expected them. Collapse has a rhythm, you can almost set a clock by it. Pride bends, cracks, then crawls back to the door it once slammed shut. Time? I didn't wait for them to beg at the threshold. I opened the door before they knocked, and with a small gesture, invited them in. They stepped inside carefully, as though entering a courtroom where they already knew the verdict. We sat at the dining table. No raised voices, no accusations, just silence, until I laid the first folder in front of them. A stack of documents, neatly clipped, each page marked with my pen. This, I said quietly, is the mortgage you refinanced 3 times. Payments. Missed foreclosure pending. I slid the paper across his hands, shook as he read his own signature, binding him to a house that was no longer his. I opened another folder. This is the business loan I co-signed. You defaulted after 18 months. Do you see the clause? Responsibility reverted to me. I pointed to the line with my pen, then leaned back, letting the weight of silence press harder than any words. Their faces paled. His wife shifted uncomfortably, glancing between us, her lips pressed thin. My son's eyes darted down each page as though searching for escape, but there was none. Every signature was his, every clause, his undoing. Next came the credit lines, the shell companies, the transfer reports. Each document stacked upon the last until the table between us became a mountain of evidence, silent, undeniable, immovable. He tried to speak, but the words caught dead. I didn't think. I raised a hand, not in anger, but in quiet finality. You didn't think. You counted on me not to notice. You thought time had dulled me. His wife attempted her last weapon, sentiment. He was under pressure. He just wanted to make you proud. Can't you forgive? Her words faltered when I pulled out the final sheet, a timeline. Every loan, every payment, every default, laid out in black and red ink. 10 years of decisions, choices, betrayals, all converging into this moment. I tapped the end of the timeline with my finger. This didn't happen overnight. It was slow, calculated, and so was my answer. The room grew still. The balance of power shifted so completely that I could feel it in the air. For years they had stood over me, taller, louder, dismissing me as irrelevant. Now they sat small, diminished, while I remained steady, unmoving. He looked at me then not as a father, not even as a man he could sway with pleas. He looked at me as what I had become, the creditor, the strategist, the one holding every piece of the board. His shoulders slumped, and I saw in his eyes the recognition that my silence all these months had not been surrender. It had been preparation. I gathered the papers slowly, neatly, and stacked them again into a single, heavy folder. I set it down between us, the sound echoing in the room like a gavel. Then I leaned forward, my voice steady, quiet, final. Let's talk terms. The silence after my words stretched until it pressed against their skin. They shifted in their chairs, restless, knowing that terms meant the begging was over, and the reckoning had begun. I slid a sheet of paper across the table, my terms. Written clearly, each line carved from years of sacrifice. First, I said, my voice calm, a public apology. Not in private whispers, not behind closed doors. You will stand before the family you dismissed me from, and you will say what you did. Every debt, every betrayal, you will speak it aloud. My son's head snapped up, his pride sputtering back to life. That's humiliating. Yes, I replied. That's the point. I turned to the next page. Second, contracts, legal documents binding you to repayment. Not vague promises. Not, I'll do better ink, signatures, and consequences if you fail again. His wife frowned. You'd take your own son to court? I met her eyes evenly. I already could. What I'm offering is mercy. I flipped to the third condition. You will submit to guidance. Every expense approved, every plan reviewed. You don't make moves without oversight. Consider it. Probation. My son scoffed, anger flaring, but his hands trembled as he reached for water he didn't drink. You want me to ask permission for my own life? You wanted my name on your loans, I said. This is the cost. The last term was written in ink darker than the rest. Therapy. For you, for your wife. You will confront the greed that led you here. You will sit in a room and learn what you failed to learn at my table. That was the one that broke them. His wife shook her head, whispering, no, that's too far. My son muttered, we don't need that. I leaned back, folded my hands, and let silence do its work. They resisted, of course. Pride sputtered, excuses rose, accusations crackled, but one by one, they withered under the weight of the papers. In front of them, they had no cards left to play. Pride doesn't pay bills. Tears don't erase contracts. In the end, survival is louder than dignity. Finally, my son slumped, his voice small. Fine, we'll do it, whatever it takes. I wrote the check slowly, the pen dragging across the paper with deliberate care. I let the ink dry before I tore it free. I placed it on the table and slid it toward him, my hand steady, my gaze unflinching. Reached for it like a starving man reaching for bread, but I did not let go until I had spoken the last truth he needed to hear. Mercy isn't free. The house was quiet again, not the hollow, aching silence of abandonment, but a calmer quiet like a storm that had finally spent itself and left the air clean. I walked through each room slowly, my hand brushing against the familiar surfaces. The edge of the dining table, the worn fabric of the couch, the banister smooth from years of touch. These walls had seen laughter, betrayal, collapse, and now, resolution. In the corner of the living room stood a photograph of my wife, her smile caught forever in a frame. I picked it up gently, the glass cool against my fingertips. For years, I had looked at this picture with longing, wishing she were still here to guide me, to soften the edges of my anger. But tonight, for the first time, I felt her presence not as absence, but as quiet approval. I carried the photo into the kitchen and set it on the table beside me. The same table that had become a war room of documents and strategies was now clear, wiped clean. The papers were gone, the contracts signed, the terms accepted. The fight was over. I poured myself a glass of water and sat in silence, savoring the stillness. Outside, the roses she had planted swayed gently in the evening breeze. Their fragrance drifted faintly through the open window, carrying memories of her tending to them with patient hands. Justice had bloomed with them this year, as if she had been guiding me all along. I thought of my son, sitting in his office now under conditions he had once mocked, forced to answer to the father he tried to erase. I thought of the humiliation in his voice as he agreed to therapy, the stiffness in his hand as he signed contracts binding him like chains. They had wanted my silence to mean defeat. They never understood that silence can also mean calculation. I leaned back in my chair, letting the cool air settle against me, and closed my eyes. There was no rage left in me, no bitterness, only the steady calm of balance restored. My life was no longer measured in debts unpaid, but in justice finally delivered. I reached out and touched the photograph again, my thumb brushing against her cheek. We did it, I whispered into the stillness. They thought kindness was weakness. They thought age meant surrender, but they forgot who built the ground they walked on. The clock on the wall ticked softly, a rhythm of peace. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own home. I felt present, whole, unshaken. They wanted me gone. Now, they can't move without me. Kindness is not weakness. It's patience, weaponized. Justice wore the scent of roses this year.